Hello and welcome to Mishnah Zevachim with Rabbi Walfish. This is our sixth and final session in this series. Mishnah in Depth is part of our Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division, sponsored in her memory by her family. Thank you to everyone who's been following along week by week as we learning day by day on the Mishnah Yomit schedule as we come up to, well, not quite the end of Zevachim, but certainly the end of our class together. It's been a pleasure learning with Rabbi Avie Walfish this whole week, these past several weeks. This class is a pre-recorded session, and sources will be shared along with the video. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Okay, we'll be looking tonight at chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Zevachim, and if we have a chance, we'll just be able to get a brief glance at the beginning of chapter 14 and maybe even comment on how it fits in with the end of the tractate at the end of chapter 14. So we've seen that starting with chapter 8, Zevachim moves into a different mode. Chapters 1 through 7 present the main laws of sacrifices from livestock, mostly about animals, which is technically called Zevachim. Mishnah relates that term Zevachim specifically to animal sacrifices in chapter 10. And then two chapters 6, 7, about bird offerings. After those 7 chapters, then we have kind of footnotes to those chapters presenting different kinds of comments, including special situations and less central halachot, more out of the way halachot related to the different sacrifices. Chapter 8 talked about mixtures, things got mixed up together, whether the live animals getting mixed up together or parts of the sacrifices getting mixed up, and how does one negotiate those situations. Chapter 9, which we'll be referring back to later on in this shiur, talked about how the main part of the chapter talks about how the mizbeach, the altar, sanctifies things that come into contact with it, that are brought on the altar, even if we're talking about disqualified sacrifices of one sort or another, what the Mishnah calls im yar alu lo yerdu, things that have been mistakenly put on top of the altar ought not to be taken down, because once they've entered into the orbit of the mizbeach, they become sanctified, and the mizbeach, as it were, does not let go, and they will be consumed on top of the mizbeach, even though ab initio they should not have been put on the mizbeach to begin with. There are some exceptions to that rule. We're not going to review the different ins and outs of that in chapter 9, but the opening is how the mizbeach consecrates even parts of sacrifices that should not have normally been offered. And then the end of the chapter, which repeats a refrain from the beginning of the chapter, creating closure in the chapter, says that just as the altar sanctifies different kinds of sacrificial parts, so too the kelim the vessels of the mikdash have a similar power, and the Mishnah then elaborates a bit on that at the rounding out the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 talked about precedence within sacrifices. When you have two sacrifices that coincide, which one should be brought first? Two dominant principles at the beginning of the chapter. One is that the more usual sacrifice is the one to be brought first. The second one is that the holier of the two sacrifices should be brought first, and then the Mishnah works that out in the bulk of chapter 10. Okay, and that now brings us up to chapter 11. Okay, so we've seen how each one of these chapters sort of takes a certain restricted topic, okay, within the laws of sacrifices. Often is not a topic that arises when some unusual circumstance occurs, or when someone has made a mistake. Okay, things that ought not to have happened. How do we negotiate that? And now we come to chapter 11, that also talks about some of the consequences of sacrificial procedures. Okay, sacrificial procedures create certain, let's call them side effects. Okay, there's certain side effects. The sacrificial procedure, some of them perhaps preventable, others not preventable. But let's take a look at the kinds of events that we're talking about. So let's open with see, do I have the text here? Here's the text. Okay. Chapter 11 opens with Dam chatat shenitaz al habeged, harei zeh ta'un kibus. Okay. Af al pi she'ena katuv medaber el banechalot, שנאמר במקום קדוש תאכל. Okay. Nevertheless, it says Torah tachatat, Torah achat, lechol achatot. Okay, so the laws you can see here, for those who need the English translation, the blood of a sin offering that was sprayed on a garment, the garment requires laundering, and the Mishnah continues to explain how we know that this applies to all chatat offerings. The pasuk refers to something more restricted. The pasuk is referring to those chatat offerings that are eaten. That's the standard chatat. That's the law of a standard chatat. But then there are special chataot for communal sins, for example, for the sins of a Kohen Gadol, for the Yom Kippur service, which are not eaten, but the animal is burnt entirely outside of the temple precincts. And this law applies to them as well. Okay, now, in order to gain some understanding of this law, we'll see the other laws a bit further on. But to gain some understanding, let's now go back and look at the verses in the Torah on which this is based. This is from chapter 6 of Vayikra, the beginning of Parashat Tzav. Daber el Aaron ve'el banav lemor, zot Torah hachatat, במקום אשר תשחט עולה תשחט את החטאת לפני השם, קודש קודשים היא. So the chatat is a korban that is called kodesh kodashim, holy of holies. Interestingly, some Bible scholars have suggested, we usually translate Holy of Holies as meaning even holier than the holy. There's the holiest of all. But some have suggested that Kodesh Kodashim might mean something that is sanctified that in turn sanctifies, something that has the ability to convey sanctity beyond itself. Okay, and this will fit in nicely with the continuation of the passage in Pasuk Kaf, Kol asher yiga bibsara yikdash, asher yizeh midama ala beged, asher yizeh aleha tichabes b'makom hadosh. Anything that touches its meat shall become holy, and if its blood becomes sprinkled on an article of clothing, it shall be laundered in a holy place. That's an interesting halacha. On the one hand, it has to be laundered. Okay, now laundering in the Torah can mean one of two things. Laundering can mean just cleansing. The Torah usually doesn't talk about laundering for the sake of cleansing. Okay, when the Torah talks about laundering a garment, what it usually means is to immerse the garment in a mikvah, okay, in order to purify it. Okay, we'll be coming back to that point very, very shortly. Okay, but here you have two of the halachot that seem to indicate that when a part of the chatat offering comes into contact with something else, let's say with something secular, something that is not inherently sacred, then something happens to that item. Okay, anything that touches its meat will become sanctified. Okay, and that seems to have particular relevance to vessels that are used for cooking, for eating, and the like. Okay, and in fact, in the rabbinic interpretation, we're going to be taking a somewhat different approach. But in the rabbinic interpretation, what this is related to notions we're familiar with from the laws of kashrut, that we're talking about, let's say, a vessel in which the meat was cooked, and so the vessel absorbs flavor from the meat, and then the vessel itself takes on some of the character of the meat, because the taste of the meat has been absorbed into its walls, and if you cook something else in that vessel, then the flavor of the meat will enter the new food. So, for example, let's say you want to use this vessel for a secular purpose, then you will have the taste of chatat meat in that food. So you would have to treat that food in some sense as chatat. Now, this creates all kinds of issues. For example, if you leave it overnight, the next day, the chatat meat is forbidden. So the flavor of the chatat meat that has now entered into the chicken soup you just cooked in it, presumably, also will become forbidden. It becomes notar. Okay, so there's a kind of ripple effect where the sanctity that's imparted, okay, translates into, what we have when we separate our meat and milk dishes. We have separate Pesach dishes. That's all based on these same notions. Okay, the flavor being absorbed and then being removed from the vessel into the next food that enters that vessel. So you have that in the mikdash as well. That's the way the rabbis interpret it. As I say, we'll be taking a looking at it from a somewhat different perspective in just a couple of minutes. But you see here how the chatat is transferring sanctity to, let's say, a vessel, okay, through the meat, the blood, if it sprays onto a garment, so the garment now has to be laundered. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. And if the chatat meat is cooked in an earthenware pot, so then that pot has to be broken. It has to be destroyed. In other words, you cannot kosher an earthenware pot. Okay, again, this is familiar to us from the laws of kashrut, and this is one of the main sources for that law of kashrut. Vim bichli nechoshet bushala, but if it was cooked in a copper pot, so then umorak v'shutaf b'mayim. Okay, then that pot needs to be scoured and rinsed in water. Okay, now the scouring part of it has been identified by Chazal with what we call hag'ala. Okay, koshering a pot. Okay, you kosher it by boiling up water in it or putting it inside another larger vessel with has boiled water in it and so on. Okay, that's how morak has been translated, but regardless of whether that is the translation that best fits the plain sense of the pasuk, the idea is not that different. Okay, you have to carefully cleanse the pot so that the flavor is removed. Okay, so, and that's similar to the idea that, as we said, the rabbis saw already in pasuk kaf. Okay, so now we have a series of laws. We have a law that coming into contact with the meat sanctifies, that the blood spraying, this is all in a korban chatat, right? The blood spraying onto a garment, okay, requires cleansing the garment, and that vessels that come into contact with heat, vessels that come into heat-related contact with the meat of the chatat, okay, need to be koshered if possible. Let's say if it's a metal utensil, but if it's an earthenware utensil, then it would have to be destroyed. Okay, now an important Bible scholar, Jacob Milgram, understands these laws as follows. The blood spots alone need to be washed out, not the entire garment. The garment does not become holy by coming into contact with the blood of the purification offering. Instead of being confiscated by the sanctuary, as would any object that is rendered holy, it is restored to its former status by having its so-called holiness effaced through washing. Thus, the garment is actually treated as if it were impure, for it is impure clothing that always requires laundering. And here I brought a couple of psukim that support that, from Vayikra chapter 11 and Vayikra chapter 15. Vanoseet nivlatam yichabes b'gadav v'tamei ad ha'arev tmeim hem alachem. Hanoseet nivlatam. Okay, a person who carries the carcass of a dead animal needs to launder his clothing, which basically means not only is he defiled, he has to purify himself by immersing himself in a mikvah, but his clothing becomes defiled along with him. Okay, we're not dealing with the laws of Tumah now, so we won't go into why this is a remarkable statement, but take my word for it that it's a departure from the standard ways in which Tumah is transmitted. This is a special form of transmitting Tumah, where a person and his clothing become Tameh together. And so the clothing needs to be laundered, i.e. purified, i.e. Immersed in a mikvah. And a similar, okay, you have a zav, okay, some sexually related form of tumah, and a more severe one than the standard garden variety forms of sexually related tumah. Okay, one who touches this zav needs to launder his clothing. Again, he becomes impure along with his clothing and has to purify not only himself but his clothing by laundering it. So Milgram argues that this is the only place in the Torah where there's a halachic requirement of laundering clothing, and therefore it stands to reason that this law, that the blood of a chatat that is sprayed onto clothing requires the clothing to be laundered. That seems to mean, says Milgram, that we treat the clothing as though it were defiled, as though it were impure. Why that is, we'll come back to in a moment. But first, let's note an argument Milgram advances in favor of this thesis. He says, instead of being confiscated by the sanctuary, as with any object that is rendered holy, this should sound familiar to us from chapter 9. Because chapter 9 talked exactly about that. When something becomes consecrated by coming into contact with the altar, then it is confiscated. That's Milgram's language. It's confiscated by the altar. The altar says, I don't release something. The altar is a black hole in that regard. Okay, you can enter its gravitational field. You can't escape the gravitational field. That's what happens when something becomes sanctified by contact with a consecrated item such as the altar. The end of chapter 9 extended that to include vessels of the mikdash. And Milgram says that's not what's happening here. If that would be what's happening here, the whole garment would become sacred. And if the whole garment is sacred, then you wouldn't launder it. You would say this is now a sanctified garment. Okay, now let's just note off the bat that this argument, although there is definitely logic to it, it's not fully convincing, because you might argue that there's only one type of consecrated garment, and that is priestly garments. You cannot consecrate a garment. A garment that is not a priestly garment can't become consecrated. So therefore, you would say you have to remove the consecrated blood, but you can't really treat the whole garment as consecrated, because that has no practical meaning. Vessels can be consecrated, especially vessels related to food. They can become consecrated. I understand how that works. Okay? Parts of animals, when they become consecrated, I understand what that means. You leave them on the altar, let them be incinerated there on top of the altar as a sacrificial offering. For a garment to become consecrated doesn't really have any meaning. So that's why Milgram's argument has plausibility to it, but is not fully convincing, and we'll be coming back to that in a bit. But first, let's see how Milgram approaches the law that comes up very shortly afterwards, okay, about the earthenware vessel that needs to be broken. If the earthen vessel is now sanctified, why the need to break it? Again, when something is sanctified, why should it be broken? Again, you could find an answer to this question. It's a cogent question, definitely a question worth considering, but the answer could simply be that vessels in the sanctuary that are consecrated are never earthenware vessels. Earthenware vessels are everyday type of vessels. They're vessels that belong to the common folk. Okay, the temple prefers vessels from materials that represent opulence, okay, that represent nobility. Earthenware vessels don't fill the bill. So even though you don't need a sanctified vessel in order to cook a chatat. You can cook a chatat just in your ordinary kitchen vessel. But then, the Torah tells us, then it will absorb sanctity. And once it's absorbed sanctity, you can't treat it as a secular vessel anymore. But on the other hand, it can't become fully consecrated as a temple vessel because it's earthenware. Okay, and therefore the only choice is to break it. Okay, so one could come up with a different model, but once again, Milgram comes up with what seems to be a powerful argument. He says, but we do find the idea of breaking earthenware vessels elsewhere. We are dealing, says Milgram, with matters of impurity, not holiness. Only impure earthenware needs to be broken. Let's look at the sukkim on which he's relying. I brought two examples. There are several others from Perek Yud Aleph Pasuk Lamed Gimel V'chol Kli Cheres Asher Yipol Mehem El Tocho. If a sheretz, okay, another type of impure dead animal. This time we're talking about like small, creepy, crawling animals called shratzim. If one of them falls into an earthenware vessel, anything inside the vessel becomes impure, and the vessel itself is broken. And similarly in Perek Tetvav, I won't read it, but you can see similar idea. If it happens to a wooden vessel, then it has to be rinsed. Okay, which presumably means you have to purify it in a mikvah. Okay, so now if you look at both of these together, Milgram says twice we see that something that seems on the surface to be that parts of the chatat convey their sanctity to clothing here, to vessels there, but the result is very unusual for what happens when sanctity is conveyed. Okay, and it looks a lot more like the model that we find with dealing with impurity. What do you do with a clothing that has become impure? You launder it. In other words, immerse in a mikvah. What do you do with a vessel that has become impure? Well, if it's a clay vessel, you break it. And if it's other kinds of vessel, so then you have to remove the impurity. Okay, so therefore, Milgram says we see the same pattern twice, so that seems to add up to something. Connect the dots, and what do we see? Okay, we see impurity, but this seems to be very strange. How does contact with a chatat create impurity? So Milgram continues and he comments. On the one hand, Scripture states flatly that any object touching the flesh of the purification offering contracts holiness. On the other hand, the object is treated as if it were impure. Okay, that's the paradox. Milgram's solution to the paradox is part of a whole thesis that he has about what we call sin offerings. Chatat, we translate as sin. Chatat from the word chet. You notice here, Milgram refers to it as a purification offering, because he translates chatat from the Hebrew word chitui, okay, which means to cleanse or to purify. Okay, when you in contemporary Hebrew we use chitui for sanitizing. You sanitize something; it's called chitui. Okay, sanitizing detergents would be called chomrei chitui. That's how he translates that. By the way, we have that in the Torah. The para aduma is also called a chatat. The reason it's called chatat is because it's mechatei. Mechatei is the root of this term chitui. It's to is to sanitize. Okay, or in the Torah, it's to purify. Okay, so Milgram thinks that the chatat offering purifies because what his argument is, when a person sins, it creates impurity. It distances him from God, creates a kind of barrier between him and God. Milgram further argues that the impurity is somehow absorbed by the sanctuary. Okay, the mikdash, like a lightning rod that attracts all of this impurity to itself, and that's why in the chatat offering you have to daub the blood on the horns of the altar, or for the holier kinds of chatat offerings, you actually sprinkle the blood inside the sanctuary, not on the altar that's out in the courtyard, but inside the sanctuary itself. Okay, and all of that is because the purpose of the chatat is less to atone for the individual and more to purify the sanctuary. Okay, you are purifying the sanctuary through the korban. Okay, there are a lot of details that need to be ironed out within this theory, but I just wanted to give you a kind of sketch of the theory so we can understand why the blood of a chatat offering and the flesh of a chatat offering, on the one hand, they're very holy. It's Kodesh Kodashim, holy of holies. But on the other hand, they have contracted impurity. It's as though they have drawn the impurity into themselves. Okay? A kind of Epsom salts that suck up the infection. Okay, suck the infection out of the body. Okay, the chatat offering soaks up the impurity. Its holiness enables it to soak up the impurity, and since it soaks up the impurity, when parts of the chatat come into contact with other items, then those other items have this dual status. They become consecrated and impure at one and the same time. And that explains these halachot according to Milgram. Okay, it's a very clever and sophisticated theory. You might be picking up that I have my reservations about it, and I prefer actually another theory that we'll get to in a bit. But before getting to that theory, let's just take a closer look at what the Mishnah does with this law. Okay? So we have Dam chatat shenitaz ala beged harei ze ta'un kibutz. That's echoing the law of the Torah. And the continuation of Mishnah Aleph then discusses how we know to apply that to every kind of korban chatat, and quotes the psukim. Well, let's look at Mishnah Bet. Okay, so instead of looking at the text on Svarya, which is always a bit complicated here on Zoom. Let's just look at the left side of this chart, and the Mishnah says, "Chatat psula ein dama ta'un kibus." What happens if the chatat became disqualified? Will its blood still require laundering the garment? And the Mishnah says, no, it will not. Ben shayala shata kosher uven shelo hayala shata kosher. Regardless of whether, regardless of whether this chatat has a shata kosher, and whether this chatat at one point was a valid sacrifice or was not at one point a valid sacrifice. Regardless, its blood does not require laundering. And then the Mishnah defines what are those that did have a shata kosher. At what point the sacrifice seemed to be a valid sacrifice. Shelana v'shenitmeit v'sheyatzat. If the sacrifice lana means was left overnight and thereby disqualified, shenitmeit, it became impure. Sheyatzat, it was taken out of the temple precincts. Ve'ezu hishalo ayala shata kosher, and what is considered to be something that never had the ability to be a kosher sacrifice. Shenishchata chutz lizmana v'chutz limkoma. This, anyone who's been following Masechet Zevachim, this is our old friend from the first 4 chapters and echoed in later chapters again. Something that was offered, that was slaughtered with improper thoughts, with the thought of taking it outside. Now notice, hayala shata kosher is, it was actually taken outside. You slaughtered it with the right intention. And then you did the wrong thing. You took it out of the temple. But what if at the time of slaughtering, you already had in mind, I'm going to take it out of the temple? Then it never had a shata kosher. Or chutz lizmana. Or you slaughtered it with the intention of eating it too late. That's parallel to lana. Lana is you actually left it over time. And shenishchata chutz lizmana means you slaughtered it with the intent of its being handled beyond its proper time. Remember, that's what we called pigul. That's how Chazal understood the concept of pigul. V'shekiblu psulin v'zarku etama. Or someone who is pasul, someone who is not a valid kohen, received the blood after the slaughtering in a vessel, and or sprinkled the blood on the altar. All of these disqualify the korban before it ever gets on track. Now, what does this chart show us? This Mishnah is clearly corresponding with Mishnah 9.2. Chapter 9 talks about how the altar claims whatever is brought on top of it, with some exceptions. And Rabbi Shimon explains that we make a differentiation. So here we have the opposite regarding the blood. The the blood of a chatat psula will not require, if it's sprayed on an article of clothing, the clothing will not need to be laundered. Okay, so this is in contrast to the opening of 9.2. Then Rabbi Shimon says, well, we have to differentiate between things that became disqualified within the framework of the temple service and those that became disqualified before the temple service began. That's parallel to 11.2. Regardless of whether it at one point was a valid sacrifice, shat kosher, or from its very inception, never had a moment when it was a valid sacrifice. These are not identical principles. We don't have time to go into the different nuances, but they certainly seem to be parallel. Okay, and then Mishnah 9.2 identifies what things are considered to be psulo b'kodesh, lan, tameh, and yotzei, and what things are considered to have a shat kosher in chapter 11, lan, tameh, yotzei. Okay, and 9.2 continues with nishchat chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo, and kiblu psulin v'zarku et damo. And 11.2 mentions the same cases, but on the other side of the ledger. These are the korbanot that never had a sha'at kosher. So it's clear then that chapter 11.2 is designed to remind us very much of 9.2, which means that the Mishnah wants us to correlate what the Mizbeach does in chapter 9, that it consecrates whatever comes on top of it, with what chapter 11 says about the blood of the chatat that's absorbed into clothing. You have to see one in light of the other. Now, that's not exactly proof that Milgram is wrong, because, after all, there is a contrast here. So Milgram could say, yes, that supports my thesis. I think, again, we don't have time to work this through. I think if you look at it more closely, you'll see it doesn't really fit his thesis. But in any event, it certainly opens up a line of thought. The Mishnah clearly wants us to read chapter 11 in light of chapter 9. And this leads me to Professor Yoni Grossman's counter argument to Milgram. Okay, it's in Hebrew, so we won't read through it. Okay, for those of you whose Hebrew is good enough, I recommend you read through it. It's a beautiful discussion. And what Grossman suggests is Milgram is right and wrong. Milgram is right that that the laws of laundering, as well as what we'll come to later in chapter 11, the laws of how you treat a vessel that is absorbed, that has come into contact with the meat, or the meat has been cooked in it. Those laws, yes, they do remind us very much of the laws of impurity. Milgram is absolutely right on that score. But Milgram argues Grossman, the wrong conclusion. The correct conclusion is that there is a profound connection between the laws of impurity and the laws of sanctity. Just as impurity is communicated through contact, through physical contact, and that applies to clothing, and that applies to vessels, and that requires laundering here and breaking here and immersing in water there, so too sanctity can be communicated through physical contact. We saw that in chapter 9, and we're seeing it again, argues Grossman, here in chapter 11. Okay, Grossman's talking about psukim in the Torah, but I'm translating it into Mishnah language. Okay, we're seeing it again in chapter 11. And what the what the Torah and the Mishnah are trying to do is not to say that the laws of chapter 11 are laws of impurity, okay? And Grossman also doesn't fully accept Milgram's thesis about how the Chatat offering works as a purification offering. That's another subject. Rather, what the Mishnah is trying to do is say, let's understand that there's a correlation. When sanctity is communicated through contact, it can often have similar consequences to that of impurity. Okay, it's a kind of opposites attract. Okay, or things that are opposite are mirror images of one another. Okay, they have a similar dynamic in each case. Okay, this is again a very suggestive idea. Our format does not allow for going into it in greater depth, but I wanted to put the idea out there so that the ideas of chapter 11, okay, could resonate and you can reflect on them further. Okay, now, interestingly, it's clear from the continuation of this chapter, okay, Mishnahs 1 through 4. Okay, let's go back for now to Svarya. Okay, Mishnahs 1 through 4. Okay, this is Mishnah 3. Is still talking about Nitaz min atzavar ala beged. Mishnah 4, Echad beged bechad asak. We're still talking about clothing that does or doesn't need laundering, depending on various details. Okay. Okay. So okay. So we have those laws, and then the chapter continues with a very interesting segue. Because now, what happens when this clothing has become sanctified? And it's clear from the Mishnah talking about sanctity, because the Mishnah raised the question, what happens when you take the blood, the clothing rather, outside of the kla'im, meaning outside of the temple courtyard? Well, if it were a problem of impurity, who cares? On the contrary, impurity should be taken out of the temple courtyard. But here we see it as a problem, because you are supposed to immerse it in a holy place. That fits Grossman's thesis much, much better, right? It's holy, and you need to immerse it in a holy place because of its holiness. And if you took it outside, that disqualifies the holiness, but you have to bring it back in. But what happens if it became impure? Again, according to Milgram, it's impure already. But according to Grossman, no, it's not impure. It's sanctified. And now it's also impure. You can't bring impure things back into the holy place. So you have to first of all, tear the garment apart so it loses its impurity. A torn garment is no longer impure. And then you bring the pieces of the garment back in and immerse them in the holy place, inside the temple. Okay? So I think the Mishnah makes it clear that they're following the Grossman model and not the Milgram model. But then the Mishnah makes a very interesting move. What about a kli cheres? Okay, here we have the second part of Mishnah 5. A kli cheres sheyatza chutz la'kla'im. We're moving on to the next prohibition. But were you talking about it? We opened the discussion of what to do with the kli cheres with a case that's exactly parallel to the garment. The kli cheres was taken outside the kla'im. You have to bring it back inside and break it there. Mishnah 6, a kli nechoshet, a copper vessel, was taken outside of the temple courtyard. Again, bring it back in for merika ushtifa. So what did the Mishnah just do? Mishnah created a segue between these laws. These laws are adjacent to one another in the Torah, and the Mishnah underscores the connection among them by introducing the kli cheres and kli nechoshet in a case that's virtually identical to the case that concluded the discussion of the garment. Okay, so the Mishnah is clearly weaving together these different laws: the garment, the earthenware vessel, the copper vessel. Okay, let's move on to chapter 12. Okay, chapter 12 opens with a new secondary topic, Tvul Yom u'Mechusar Kippurim. We know from chapter 2 that they are disqualified priests. They cannot serve, cannot perform the temple service, but interestingly, says the Mishnah, Einan cholkin b'kodashim lechol ha'erev. They will become purified that evening, especially the Tvul Yom. Tvul Yom, okay, by the end of the day, he will be purified. So maybe he can eat the sacred foods. So he can participate in the division of the sacrifices. There are parts of the sacrifices divided up among the Kohanim. The Tvul Yom can't participate in that, even though by nightfall he'll be able to partake of the sacrifice. But since right now he's disqualified from the sacrificial service, okay, so we don't allow him to take part in the dividing up of the sacrifices. Okay? But then, very interestingly, the Mishnah continues. Balei mumin cholkin vochlin. This is a Kohen who is fully disqualified, but he is not disqualified from eating. Okay? So there's a kind of ambivalent connection here between participating in the service and getting the perks, okay? Getting a portion of the sacrificial food that you will be consuming. The Baal Mum is in, he can't serve, but he can be included, maybe because for him it's a longer term disqualification. So we're saying, but he's still a Kohen, so that has to have some impact. He can be part of the temple service, even though he can't actively perform the temple service. At least when it comes to eating the sacrifices, he's a Kohen. Whereas the forms of defilement, that knocks them out of the box. Of course, that has a solution. They will become pure and then they'll be back in the ring. Okay, but as of now, they are still impure and out of the ring. Now, the Mishnah continues with other connections between what the Kohanim get as their portion and performing the service. This is an idea that comes up in the Psukim already. The Pasuk is quoted here in the Mishnah. Okay, but any sacrifice where the meat is not offered on the altar, we're talking about an olah sacrifice, which can't be brought, it was disqualified. Lo zachu kohanim ba'orah. Then the kohanim are also disqualified from receiving part of the hides. That's another perk of the Kohen. They get the hides of the olah sacrifices, but only when the sacrifice was offered. In other words, the Kohanim are in a way an extension of the altar. Okay? When the altar gets what's coming to the altar, then the Kohen gets what's coming to him. And if it's derailed from the altar, then it's derailed from the Kohen as well. Okay, okay, I think that's about what we'll have time for in chapter 12. And now let's look at chapter 13. Chapter 13 opens a new secondary topic, but a topic that really opens up the finale of Tractates Zevachim. Hashochet va'amaleh b'chutz. The one who slaughters or offers up, I hesitate to say on the altar, but maleh would mean that he would burn it. He would incinerate it outside of the temple. So it could be on an altar, but not on the altar, because the altar is not b'chutz. The altar is inside the temple courtyard. So if you slaughter a sacrificial animal outside of the temple courtyard, and or if you take the parts of the animal that are supposed to be incinerated and burn them on an altar outside of the temple courtyard, okay, you are chayav al hashchita v'chayav al ha'aliyah. Okay, and that creates a halachic discussion that we won't have time for. Okay, but let's just note what's happening here in chapter 13 is the Mishnah is returning us to a theme that was very central and very dominant especially at the beginning of the tractate, and that is place. Remember, we had chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo. That was the main theme of chapters 1 through 4, echoed again. We saw it again in chapters 9 and 11, okay, echoed once again, chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo. The centrality of place is emphasized also in chapter 5. Ezehu mikoman shel zvachim. Okay, what is the place of the sacrifices? Meaning the place where it's slaughtered, the place where the blood is offered, the place, okay, where the meat is consumed. Okay, all these are places, and that's the main theme of chapter 5. And now, chapters 13 and 14 are going to be devoted pretty much exclusively to the notion of place. Starting off with, what if you do it outside? Okay, again, we started with, what if you do it, you slaughter it, let's say, with the intention of taking it outside? That disqualifies the sacrifice off the bat. Now we're taking a sacrifice and offering it outside. The Torah prohibits that. Chayav. Chayav means chayav karet. Okay? Is considered to be a very severe prohibition. Okay? Sacrifices must be brought in the temple. Okay? Just last Shabbat, that was a central theme in Parashat Re'eh. Okay, Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. All sacrifices must be brought there and only there. Nothing shall be brought anywhere else. Right? So okay, so you have this. If you violate that, that's a very serious prohibition. Okay, now that of course leads into all kinds of ins and outs as the Mishnah works through various various details. Okay, well, let's just take a very brief look at the beginning of chapter 14. We continue with Harat Chatat Shesrafa Chutz Migita. Now we're talking about quasi-sacrificial animals. They're not exactly sacrifices. Harat Chatat is the paraduma, the red heifer. It's not really a sacrifice. And of course it's slaughtered outside of the temple and it's burnt outside of the temple. But what if it's burnt outside of its pit? The pit being an excavation on the Mount of Olives, designated for its slaughter and its burning. Or the shiur mishtaleach, the scapegoat. It's supposed to be sent out into the wilderness. So what if he krivo bachutz? What if you brought it as a sacrifice outside the temple? Patur. Why? Because the only sacrifices that have to be inside the temple are those about which it says, Vel petach oil moed lo hevio. Kol sheino ra'ui lavo el petach oil moed ein chayavin alav. Only the sacrifices that are designed to be brought inside are you chayav for if you offer them outside. Okay, and so this now becomes the major theme of the last two chapters. And let's just conclude by taking a very brief look at the very end of chapter 14. Until the tabernacle was established, private altars were permitted. Oh, we just talked about how if you offer outside of the temple area, then it's a very serious prohibition. But there were times in Jewish history that one was allowed to offer on bamot. That's a biblical term. Go through the book of Kings and you see Rak habamot lo saru as a refrain. Okay, that was the transgression of many of the Judean kings, that they did not end the practice of offering on bamot. So there's a time when they were permitted. Then the Mishkan was constructed and it became prohibited, and so on. A whole history of when it was permitted, when it was prohibited. That's for the class you will be learning Be'ezrat Hashem next week. Hopefully that will be discussed then. But that really concludes the tractate, again with the theme of place. Okay, and let's just conclude with the following thought. We raised the idea in previous shiurim that as much as you can see the altar as a place for bringing sacrifices, you can see the sacrifices as a means of feeding the altar. The eternal fire that burns on the altar, okay, is fed by the sacrifices that are offered. That, of course, gives special significance to the idea of place. The place that is dedicated to God has to have an eternal fire that expresses the passionate bond between God and Am Yisrael, okay? And it has to be focused on and concentrated in one special place. And so, Tractates Zevachim, from its very beginning until its very end, really focuses us very heavily on this theme of sacred space. We'll conclude with that. Thank you all for attending these shiurim, and I look forward to teaching you again in Masechet Chulin in another couple of months.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Walfish. And I'd like to remind people that Mishnah in depth will be continuing, although not next week. We will be picking up starting on Sunday, September 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, as with previously, for Menachot with Rabbi Joshua Kulp. I really hope you are able to keep learning with us. You can sign up for Mishnah in depth Menachot and other Elul classes at drisha.org/classes. And Rabbi Walfish, if people have any lingering questions, how can they get in touch with you?
Okay, you can post my email and I'll be happy to respond.
All right. Well, great. Thank you very much for these past couple of weeks. And to all those listening out there on the recording, thank you for listening. Take care.